When people hear the phrase defeating a narcissist, they may imagine an argument where you finally say the perfect words, expose every lie, or make the other person admit that they were wrong. But psychological healing usually looks very different from that. You do not truly defeat a narcissistic person by humiliating them, outsmarting them, or getting revenge. You defeat the pattern when their ability to control your emotions, your attention, your choices, and your sense of self begins to disappear. That is the real shift. And when that shift happens, their behavior may change, not because you have magically transformed them, but because the old dynamic is no longer producing the same results. One of the most important things to understand is that narcissistic patterns often depend heavily on interpersonal reactions. Attention, emotional reactions, arguments, reassurance, admiration, fear, guilt, and even your attempts to prove yourself can become part of a dysfunctional cycle. When you stop participating in that cycle, the person may experience a significant change in the relationship. This does not mean every person with narcissistic traits will respond in exactly the same way. Human behavior is more complicated than a checklist. But there are recognizable patterns that can emerge when someone realizes that their usual methods of influence are no longer working. The first sign may be an increase in attempts to provoke you. Suddenly, something that used to produce a major emotional reaction from you no longer does. You do not rush to defend yourself. You do not spend hours explaining what really happened. You do not feel compelled to correct every accusation. You simply recognize what is happening and decide that you are not going to participate. For someone who has become accustomed to getting emotional energy from you, this can create a very different interpersonal environment. You might notice insults, accusations, sudden criticism, exaggerated statements, or attempts to reopen old conflicts. The goal may not always be consciously planned. Sometimes people with strong narcissistic traits simply return to familiar strategies because those strategies worked before. If criticism used to make you defend yourself, they may criticize you again. If guilt used to make you apologize for things that were not your responsibility, they may try guilt again. If anger used to make you panic, they may become angry again. But your response has changed. And that is where your power is. You do not need to prove that you are stronger. You do not need to win the argument. You can simply recognize this interaction is not productive for me and step away. That is emotional maturity, not defeat. Your goal is not to control their behavior. Your goal is to regain control over your own behavior. The second sign can be a sudden shift in how they treat you. A person who once criticized you constantly may suddenly become charming. Someone who ignored your boundaries may suddenly become unusually attentive. They may remind you of the good memories, compliment you, apologize vaguely, promise that everything will be different, or suddenly behave like the person you always hoped they would become. This is where education becomes extremely important because People recovering from narcissistic relationships can become vulnerable to confusing temporary behavior with lasting change. Real change is not demonstrated through a few emotional conversations. It is demonstrated through consistent behavior over time. A meaningful apology includes accountability. It does not simply say, "I'm sorry you felt hurt." It recognizes what happened, acknowledges the impact, and demonstrates a willingness to behave differently. So, if someone suddenly becomes charming after you establish boundaries, do not immediately assume that the relationship has transformed. Observe. Give yourself time. Look at patterns rather than promises. You do not have to reject someone simply because they are being nice, but you also do not have to abandon your boundaries because someone is temporarily being pleasant. The third sign may be an attempt to rewrite the story. When you stop accepting someone else's version of reality, they may begin telling a different story about what happened. Suddenly, you become the difficult one. You become too sensitive. You are accused of being selfish, cold, ungrateful, dramatic, or impossible to please. This can be deeply confusing because you may have spent years questioning yourself. You may think, maybe I really am the problem. That is why developing your own internal reality is so important. Ask yourself, what actually happened? What patterns did I repeatedly observe? How did I feel before, during, and after interactions? Did I constantly have to apologize? Did I feel responsible for another adult's emotions? Did I repeatedly abandon my own needs to keep the peace? You do not need another person's permission to recognize what you experienced. At the same time, healthy self-reflection matters. Healing does not mean automatically believing that you were perfect and the other person was entirely responsible for everything. It means becoming honest about your own behavior while refusing to take responsibility for behavior that belongs to someone else. The fourth sign is that they may test whether your boundaries are actually real. This is one of the most important parts of the process. A boundary is not simply a statement. A boundary is what you do when someone violates the limit you have communicated. You might say, "I will not continue a conversation when I'm being insulted." The real test comes when the insults begin. Do you stay and argue for another hour? Or do you end the conversation? You might say, "I am not comfortable discussing my private life with you." The real test comes when they demand information. Do you start explaining yourself, or do you calmly repeat that you are not discussing it? This is why boundaries can initially feel uncomfortable. If you have spent a long time accommodating another person's reactions, setting a boundary may trigger guilt. You may feel cruel simply for saying no. But discomfort does not mean you are doing something wrong. Sometimes discomfort is simply what happens when you begin doing something unfamiliar. The fifth sign is that they may attempt to pull you back into emotional chaos. This can happen through conflict, nostalgia, guilt, emergencies, accusations, jealousy, dramatic declarations, or sudden emotional intensity. Again, this does not mean every crisis is fake. or every emotional expression is manipulative. Life is complicated and genuine problems happen. The important question is whether you consistently feel responsible for rescuing the other person. If every time you create distance, another emotional crisis appears, you need to slow down. Ask yourself whether you are responding from compassion or from fear, guilt, and obligation. Healthy compassion does not require self-abandonment. You can care about someone without becoming responsible for managing their emotional world. You can wish someone well without returning to a harmful dynamic. You can have empathy and still say no. And the sixth sign, the most important one, is that you stop needing them to validate your reality. This is the real victory. At the beginning of healing, you may desperately want the narcissistic person to admit what they did. You may want them to say, "Yes, I hurt you. Yes, I manipulated you. Yes, I was wrong." You may imagine that one day they will finally understand everything and give you the closure you deserve. But eventually, healing can lead you somewhere different. You realize that closure does not always come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes closure comes from understanding the pattern yourself. You recognize that their inability to acknowledge your pain does not make your pain less real. Their denial does not erase your experience. Their criticism does not define your character. Their refusal to understand you does not mean you failed to communicate. And this is where the word defeat needs to be redefined. You did not defeat them because you destroyed them. You defeated the dynamic because it no longer controls you. You no longer need to chase their approval. You no longer need to win every argument. You no longer need to explain yourself endlessly. You no longer need to monitor their moods. You no longer organize your life around avoiding their reactions. You begin making decisions based on your values instead of their expectations. That is freedom. And freedom can look surprisingly quiet. Sometimes the strongest response is not a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it is simply refusing to participate in the same cycle. You become less reactive, more deliberate, more grounded. You learn that silence does not have to be punishment. Distance does not have to be revenge. A boundary does not have to be an attack. You are simply choosing what you will and will not participate in. If you are currently trying to recover from a relationship characterized by narcissistic behaviors, remember this. Your healing should not depend on whether the other person recognizes what they did. Their behavior may change, or it may not. They may understand you, or they may never understand you. They may apologize, or they may continue defending themselves. Your responsibility is not to force insight into another person. Your responsibility is to build insight within yourself. Learn your patterns. Learn your boundaries. Learn what respectful communication looks like. Learn the difference between accountability and blame. Learn to recognize when you are being pulled into an argument that has no healthy destination. Most importantly, learn to trust yourself again. Because when you have spent a long time in a confusing relationship, the greatest damage is sometimes not what the other person said about you. It is the way you gradually stop trusting your own perception. Healing means rebuilding that trust. And when you finally reach the point where another person's manipulation no longer determines your emotional state, that is not just a victory over a relationship dynamic. It is a victory for your own life. You are no longer living to prove something to them. You are living according to who you are. That is what real freedom looks like. One of the clearest signs that you have genuinely broken free from a narcissistic dynamic is that the other person may suddenly work harder to provoke an emotional reaction from you. This is important to understand because the goal is not necessarily to win an argument. The real shift happens when you stop giving someone automatic access to your emotions. If they were accustomed to seeing you become defensive, anxious, angry, guilty, or desperate to explain yourself, your calmness can completely change the dynamic. In unhealthy relationships, emotional reactions can become part of a repetitive cycle. They criticize you, you defend yourself. They accuse you, you explain. They become angry. You try to calm them down. They withdraw. You chase them for answers. Over time, this can become so predictable that you respond almost automatically. But when you begin healing, something changes. You pause. You recognize the pattern. You stop rushing to prove yourself. That change can sometimes lead to increased attempts to get a reaction. You might receive provocative messages, unnecessary criticism, accusations about your character, or attempts to reopen old arguments. They may bring up something from months or years ago because they know it used to trigger you. They may make statements designed to make you defend your intentions or question yourself. The important lesson is this: you do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. Not every accusation deserves a response. Not every misunderstanding needs a lengthy explanation. Not every insult requires you to prove that you are a good person. When you understand this, you begin protecting your emotional energy. This does not mean becoming cold or cruel. It means becoming intentional. You can communicate when communication is necessary, but you no longer feel compelled to respond to every provocation. You can say, "I'm not going to continue this conversation while we are speaking disrespectfully," and then disengage. You can choose not to respond immediately when you are emotionally activated. Most importantly, do not measure your progress by whether the other person becomes upset. Measure it by whether you remain grounded. The goal is not to make them angry. The goal is to stop allowing their anger to control you. When you reach the point where someone can criticize you without sending you into panic, accuse you without making you desperate to prove yourself, or provoke you without controlling your entire day, something powerful has happened. You have begun taking your emotional life back, and that is a form of freedom no argument could ever give you. Another sign that the old dynamic is losing its power is when the narcissistic person suddenly becomes unusually charming, affectionate, apologetic, or attentive. This can be confusing, especially if you have spent a long time waiting for the kindness you are now receiving. You may think, maybe they finally understand. Maybe everything is going to be different now. That hope is completely human. But healing requires you to slow down and observe rather than immediately believing the change. In relationships involving strong narcissistic patterns, periods of warmth can sometimes appear after conflict, rejection, or emotional distance. The person may suddenly compliment you, remind you of wonderful memories, promise that they have changed, or tell you exactly what you have wanted to hear. They may become unusually interested in your life after previously dismissing your feelings. If you have been deprived of validation for a long time, this attention can feel incredibly powerful. But attention is not the same thing as accountability. A genuine change is demonstrated through consistent behavior over time. Someone who has truly developed greater awareness will not simply become pleasant when they fear losing access to you. They will show respect even when they are frustrated. They will accept your boundaries without punishing you. They will take responsibility without immediately blaming you. They will be able to hear difficult feedback without turning the entire conversation into an attack on your character. This is why you should pay attention to patterns rather than promises. You do not have to become cynical just because someone is being nice. You can appreciate a positive interaction while still maintaining healthy boundaries. You can listen without immediately reopening emotional access. You can accept an apology without believing that you are required to return to the relationship exactly as it was. Sometimes people feel guilty for remaining cautious when someone suddenly becomes kind. They think, if I don't give them another chance, maybe I'm being unfair. But caution is not cruelty. You are allowed to take your time. Ask yourself what happens when you say no. What happens when you disagree? What happens when you maintain a boundary? What happens when they do not get what they want? Those moments often reveal much more than affectionate words ever could. Real change is not measured by how wonderful someone can be when they want something from you. It is measured by how consistently respectful they remain when they are disappointed, frustrated, or unable to control the outcome. And this is where your healing becomes powerful. You no longer chase the version of someone you desperately hoped they would become. You observe the person they consistently choose to be. You stop asking, what if this time is different? Instead, you ask, what does their behavior consistently show me? That question can protect you from returning to a cycle simply because someone temporarily became charming again. Another pattern you may notice when you stop participating in an unhealthy dynamic is that the story begins to change. Suddenly, the person who hurt you may present themselves as the victim, while portraying you as the problem. They may describe you as too sensitive, too difficult, selfish, cold, ungrateful, dramatic, or impossible to satisfy. This can be deeply confusing because you may have spent so much time questioning yourself that their version of events starts to sound believable. This is why rebuilding trust in your own perception becomes such an important part of healing. When someone repeatedly challenges your reality, you can eventually become dependent on their interpretation of what happened. You may find yourself thinking, did I really overreact? Was I actually being unreasonable? Maybe I should have handled it differently. Healthy self-reflection is valuable, but there is a difference between examining your behavior honestly and automatically accepting someone else's version of reality. If you made a mistake, you can acknowledge it. If you communicated poorly, you can learn from it. But taking responsibility for your own behavior does not mean accepting responsibility for another person's choices. Sometimes the rewriting of the story becomes especially noticeable when you stop defending yourself. If you no longer spend hours explaining what happened, the other person may fill that silence with their own narrative. They might tell mutual friends, relatives, or other people that you abandoned them, mistreated them, changed completely, or became selfish. The temptation can be to immediately correct every accusation. But you need to ask yourself whether every accusation deserves your energy. There is a point in healing where you realize that constantly defending yourself can keep you emotionally connected to the person you are trying to move away from. You do not need to convince everyone. The people who genuinely care about you will often pay attention to patterns, behavior, and consistency rather than simply accepting the loudest version of a story. Most importantly, do not allow someone else's anger to become evidence against yourself. Someone being disappointed with your boundary does not mean the boundary is wrong. Someone calling you selfish does not automatically make you selfish. Someone saying that you have changed does not mean you have become a worse person. Sometimes you have changed because you have finally stopped abandoning yourself. That is a crucial distinction. You may have become less available, but that does not necessarily mean you became uncaring. You may have become quieter, but that does not mean you became weak. You may have stopped explaining yourself, but that does not mean you have something to hide. Sometimes growth looks like refusing to participate in a distorted version of reality. You can acknowledge your mistakes without accepting false guilt. You can remain compassionate without surrendering your boundaries. You can listen to criticism without allowing it to define your identity. And eventually, you begin to understand that you do not need to win the narrative. You simply need to remain honest with yourself. When your peace no longer depends on convincing someone else that your experience was real, their ability to rewrite your story loses much of its power. You begin standing firmly in your own understanding of what happened while still remaining open to genuine self-reflection. That balance is not arrogance. It is emotional maturity, one of the most revealing moments in any unhealthy relationship is what happens after you establish a boundary. Before you begin setting boundaries, you may have spent a long time explaining yourself, compromising, keeping the peace, or changing your behavior to prevent another person's reaction. You may have learned to anticipate their moods before expressing your own needs. So when you finally say, "This is no longer acceptable to me," the real test is not whether they agree with you. The real test is whether you can remain consistent when they push back. A boundary is not a threat, punishment, or attempt to control another person. A boundary is a decision about what you will do to protect your own emotional and physical well-being. For example, you might decide that you will end a conversation when someone begins insulting you. You might decide that you will not discuss private information with someone who repeatedly uses it against you. You might decide that you will only communicate about necessary matters and will not engage in personal arguments. When you make that decision, someone accustomed to having greater access to you may test it. They may ask the same question repeatedly. They may become angry. They may accuse you of changing. They may say that you are selfish, disrespectful, uncaring, or difficult. Sometimes they may temporarily respect the boundary and then test it again later. This is where many people become confused. They think, maybe my boundary is too harsh. But discomfort from another person does not automatically mean your boundary is unreasonable. Imagine that you have always answered their calls immediately. Now you decide that you will respond when you are available. If they become angry because you did not answer within 5 minutes, their anger is information. It does not mean you did something wrong. Or imagine that you have always stayed in conversations even when you were being insulted. You finally say, "If the conversation becomes disrespectful, I will end it." When the insults begin, following through is what makes the boundary real. You do not need to announce your boundary repeatedly. You do not need to give a 20-minute explanation. You do not need to convince the other person that your boundary is morally correct. A boundary becomes stronger when your actions consistently support it. This can feel uncomfortable at first because people who are used to over-accommodating others often experience guilt when they begin protecting themselves. You may feel selfish simply because you said no. You may feel responsible for someone's disappointment. You may worry that you are becoming the kind of person you never wanted to be, but having boundaries does not make you cruel. You can be kind and still have limits. You can care about someone and still refuse disrespect. You can understand someone's feelings without taking responsibility for managing them. And perhaps the most important lesson is that you do not have to punish someone for crossing a boundary. You simply follow through with the consequence you already decided upon. If the conversation becomes abusive, you end it. If the interaction becomes unhealthy, you step away. If someone repeatedly violates your limits, you create more distance. The goal is not to make the other person suffer. The goal is to stop suffering yourself. When your boundaries become consistent, you may notice something profound. You begin trusting yourself again. You realize that you can protect your peace without waiting for someone else's permission. That is what genuine progress looks like. You are no longer asking, "How do I make them respect me?" You are asking, "What will I do when they don't?" And that shift changes everything. Another powerful sign that the old dynamic is losing its grip is when emotional chaos no longer automatically pulls you back in. In unhealthy relationships, intensity can sometimes become confused with love, urgency with responsibility, and conflict with connection. You may become accustomed to constantly responding to someone's emotions, solving their problems, calming their anger, reassuring their insecurity, or trying to prevent the next crisis. Eventually, you can begin living in a state of emotional readiness, always waiting for the next phone call, message, accusation, argument, or sudden change in mood. When you start stepping away from that pattern, the emotional intensity may increase. There may suddenly be dramatic conversations, accusations, desperate messages, jealousy, guilt, nostalgia, or declarations about how much you are needed. Sometimes the person may suddenly remind you of the best moments in the relationship. Other times, they may focus on how badly you have supposedly treated them. The common element is that the interaction creates an emotional pressure that makes you feel like you have to respond immediately. But you do not always have to respond immediately. One of the most important skills in healing is learning to create space between what happens and how you respond. If you receive an emotionally charged message, you do not have to answer while you are frightened, angry, or guilty. You can pause. You can breathe. You can reread the message later. You can ask yourself, what is actually being asked of me here? And am I responding because I genuinely want to, or because I am afraid of what will happen if I don't? That distinction is incredibly important. Compassion can make you want to help someone who is genuinely struggling. But compassion does not mean becoming responsible for another adult's emotional stability. You can care about someone's pain without making yourself available for repeated emotional manipulation. You can acknowledge someone's feelings without agreeing with their accusations. You can wish someone well without returning to a relationship pattern that repeatedly harmed you. This is especially important when guilt is involved. Someone might say, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat